We changed our internet service provider a few months ago, and when you do that, you have to give your wireless internet service a name. Not wanting to waste a perfectly good opportunity to sort of mess with our neighbors, I named our service the FBI surveillance van, which, given my rather nonconformist reputation around here, was not immediately interpreted as being just a joke by some of our church members who, during a lull in the service, evidently were looking for local internet services and discovered the FBI surveillance van. I'm confident that I wasn't preaching when you guys were looking for something on the internet, but Sean, you might want to be insulted just for your music service. But what seemed kind of funny to me back in February has taken a rather more serious turn in recent weeks. It turns out that our government has been spying, not just on me or on us, but on everyone in the United States and most of the people around the world. Beyond spy satellites we've known about, drones with cameras, now couple that with cameras on intersections, in train and bus stations, in airports, on the fronts of banks, retail stores. We've discovered on top of all of that, our government has the ability to keep all of our phone records, to record almost anyone's conversation at will, without cause, and read or survey everyone's email. Now, in the not too distant past, we had an understanding that we had certain constitutional rights that guaranteed our privacy. We understood that our mail was sacred, and even our telephones couldn't be tapped without a court order by a judge who had been presented with probable cause. As technology has changed the way we communicate, and the way all of us now talk is either through email or over digital cell phones, the government finds itself able to record all of that. And because they're able, they're doing it. Now, the Fourth Amendment to the Constitution assures us that the government has to present a darn good reason to stick its nose into our business. But the Patriot Act gutted our legal privacy, but long after the tension and anxiety that surrounded 9/11 had passed, the Patriot Act was supposed to sunset. But instead of letting it simply pass out of existence, the government not only renewed it, but they strengthened it, so that these indefensible, inexplicable invasions of our privacy that we've just learned about in the last week may not even be illegal. It may be that everything they've done was perfectly legal under this Patriot Act, which I've got to say is now demonstrably really bad legislation. Now, it must be said that our various intelligence agencies have had some laudable successes in preventing terrorist attacks. I don't want to fail to applaud those important victories. I think that's real. They've been much more successful than have our military efforts at fighting terrorism. But playing around in the back of my mind in the midst of all of this is that famous quote from Ben Franklin in which he said, "Those who are willing to sacrifice their liberty in exchange for security deserve neither and are likely to lose both." As soon as there are enough people who live in close proximity to one another to compete for food, shelter, water, then there is a need for a government. You can't really live without a government that helps us to govern our own appetites so that we can live in close proximity to one another successfully. But from the very beginning of time, there's been just in our genetic makeup a tendency to stratify, so that some people are just more important than other people. And those people then will claim a larger share of the land, of the food, of the water, of the natural resources, beyond which they can even use, while others have less than enough to survive. Now, you could say that this is a matter of politics, or you could say that it is a matter of religion, but it seems to me that necessarily it has to be both. Our scripture lesson this morning describes an ancient and a very seminal exchange between a monarch and a citizen. Naboth had a small family vineyard in Jerusalem near the palace of King Ahab. And Ahab wanted it for his own use. He wanted to have a vegetable garden there. And you know, the palace had lots of servants. There were a lot of people there. There was a bigger demand for food. So it made a certain sense for the king to be able to have it, but what was a part of Hebrew Scripture, whether they ever implemented it or not, was this notion that there should never be a ruling aristocracy and a permanently impoverished class. So you couldn't sell your land. You could lease it, but it always had to come back to your family. You couldn't even sell yourself into slavery. You could for a period of time, but it always has to come back so that there would never be a huge disparity between the top 2% and the lower 98%. So Naboth said, no, I don't want to sell you my family's vineyard. I don't want to go against literally the values of Israel. I want to maintain my land. And King Ahab became very depressed about that. And they didn't have predator drones back then, so his wife had to hatch a rather more nefarious plot in which they falsely accused Naboth, had a sham trial, and they killed him so that the king could take his land. Now, the Hebrew Bible has many such examples of warnings about abuse of state power and the limitations that are necessary to that power in order to maintain the sacred value of human life. Once you let one group of people become unquestioned in their authority, then everyone beneath them loses their value as a human being. I believe it's safe to say that this is a theme in all Western religions. Zoroastrianism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all have an innate sense in which people ought to have the same value. In Zoroastrianism, nobody gets buried. There's not a huge tomb for a wealthy person and a pauper's field for the poor to be buried in. Everyone has their body placed on top of a tower of silence so that no one has any lasting monument to their having been more important than anyone else. Judaism began as a slave revolt against the oppressive powers of Egypt. Christianity began in an occupied land of the very poor and oppressed people looking for power. Even in Islam, Muhammad had basically supported himself and his tribe by robbing caravans. These were the poor struggling to survive. And for his entire life, Muhammad dressed in robes that were tattered and torn like those of a pauper, with him emphasizing that no one should consider themselves to be of greater value than anyone else. And I believe that any time that we lose sight of that value in our religion, whether that religion is Islam or Judaism or Christianity, when you lose sight of that value, your religion begins to shift from being a meaningful faith into becoming a meaningless superstition with rituals and magic. I wish that it wasn't so, but power, political power, always is in need of being held in check. Because unless it is challenged, those in control begin to decide that there are certain groups of people who are expendable, whether they're the poor, or blacks, or Jews, or gays, or immigrants, or now even the middle class. Now, we've been assured by the likes of Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, that as long as you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to fear from this government invasion of privacy. Now, if Graham had been aware that the Nazi propaganda director, Joseph Goebbels, had said to the people in Germany, as long as you're not doing anything wrong, you have nothing to fear from the government's invasion of your privacy. If he had known that, he probably would have said it in a different way. And I don't want to be guilty of comparing everything to Nazi Germany. I think that's brought up way too often. So this is my one time in 2013 that I'm going to make a comparison to Nazi Germany. But Lindsey Graham and many of the people who are in charge of the NSA's blanket permission to take information from absolutely everyone are not aware of what that has meant historically. I think that this current crisis about the IRS is entirely ginned up. Look, if you're starting a group that names itself after a tax revolt, the Tea Party, and then you apply for special tax exempt status, I think you're begging for extra scrutiny. I really don't see anything wrong with that. I don't think our police should use profiling to decide who they're going to pull over and inspect their car and their belongings. But, there's a guy that lives over near MSU who has a vanity tag that says Zigzag. And for those of you that don't know, Zigzag is a very popular brand of rolling papers. Now, I think if you put that marijuana rolling paper brand on your tag, you're probably asking the police to pull you over and check you out. But otherwise, that's wrong. What this NSA is doing, this is big. I don't believe that they will only look for people who are hatching terrorist plots. Once you give yourself permission to gather that much information, our government has a long history of using personal information to control their opposition, to ruin the credibility of their critics. The CIA kept records on Martin Luther King's affairs. Several prominent religious war protesters, Thomas Merton, the Berrigan brothers, all had CIA files. They were looking for ways to ruin them. When you consider the case of someone like New York Governor Eliot Spitzer, who was forced to resign in 2008 in the midst of a sex scandal, you see how information like this can be used against government critics. Spitzer had been known as the Sheriff of Wall Street because he understood the complex financial instruments that were being used by investment houses in New York, and he helped to safeguard the public interest. All of us who have pension funds and retirement funds, most of us have no idea what we're invested in. We have no idea how that money is being moved around or how much of it is being kept by the people who simply handle the paper. But when it was discovered that Spitzer was a regular customer of a high-end prostitution service, he was removed from office because, as you know, none of us have ever heard of a fabulously wealthy man using his money to have sex with beautiful young women. We were shocked by this, and something had to be done. Now, I have two observations to make about that. Wall Street, without an aggressive sheriff, went wild. They plundered the retirement savings and home investment mortgages of millions of people. They trashed the world's economy. They caused massive unemployment, home foreclosures. They made it impossible for many elderly citizens to retire. They made it impossible for many young college graduates to find a job. It left many in the middle class no longer able to own their own home or to send their kids to college. Now, Spitzer really shouldn't have had sex with that prostitute. That was a bad thing, and I think his wife should have divorced him, and I hope his kids didn't send him a Father's Day card for years. However, a victimless crime contrasted with the protection that was being provided to millions of people? Really? Are we really so simple-minded? Are we really so addicted to gossip and puritanical values that we would make a decision to expose millions of people to disastrous consequences because this governor had sex with a woman outside of marriage? And how was Spitzer's tryst discovered? We were initially told that, if you have transactions in your checking account of over $10,000, that the bank has the right to review what those transactions might have been. It could be suspicious. That's how we were told that Spitzer's illegal conduct was discovered, but that's not true. None of his transactions came to even half of the amount that should have triggered an investigation. The banks were looking for a way to get rid of Spitzer, so they went deeper. They looked into smaller transactions for which they had no right to review them. I'm afraid that much the same may have happened to Julian Assange, the Australian founder of WikiLeaks, who has defied American military and intelligence agencies by giving classified information to the public. And our government, I'm afraid, is trying to build a rape case against him that may be little more than a fabrication. I'm not saying that Assange's personal morals wouldn't disqualify him to be a member of clergy. But if you review every part of most people's lives, they wouldn't pass that test either. In fact, I know a lot of preachers, and most of them wouldn't pass that test either. There are not many people who could survive an NSA white glove test if they're allowed to dig into absolutely everything in our personal lives. The public has been manipulated by the dumbing down effect of these neo-puritanical sexual witch hunts. If we really are grown-ups, if we really are capable of analytical thought, why then are we still so vulnerable to this middle school boys' locker room mentality in which we just constantly keep throwing human beings onto the trash heap marked, "You would have embarrassed my mother's Sunday school class"? Religious people have been sold a bill of goods, and having been told that the Lord God Almighty, the creator of the universe, is just as obsessed with people's bedroom lives as is the tabloid media you see when you're standing in the grocery store checkout lane. We are being manipulated both by a government use of fear of terrorism so that we will not object to their ever-increasing invasion into our privacy for reasons that frankly look very, very dubious to me. Did you know that more Americans have been killed this year by gun-wielding toddlers than have been killed by terrorists? Should the NSA start spying on preschoolers? After all, guns don't kill people. Toddlers kill people. Thankfully, no one told the Old Testament prophet Elijah not to mix politics and religion. Elijah didn't just preach about the sane limits of political power. He went into the king's house. He confronted him to his face, assuring him that dogs would lick up his blood in the same place where the blood of a righteous citizen had been illegally spilled. The progressive church now wears the prophet's mantle. We must stand up to the monarchs of our day, and we have to do it fearlessly, consistently, and we have to refuse to be manipulated by the distraction of, oh, here's another sex scandal, or here's some minor offense that asks us to look away from the major issues of the world. There are things we really ought to be worried about that we are missing because we're being asked to worry about people's private sex lives. Here's some things I think we should be worried about. The decline of our civilization because of an income disparity that transfers more and more of the wealth of this country into the hands of fewer and fewer people. We should be concerned about the fact that almost all of our food production is being passed into the hands of only 4 or 5 corporations that are motivated by profit and not by health. We should not allow our planet's resources to be used up in this generation, and we should not allow our air, water, and land to be polluted for temporary profit. We should not favor banks over homeowners. We should not sit idly by while the poor are being kept out of colleges and hospitals and home ownership. We will not tolerate forcing our elderly to work until they drop dead, standing at the front of Walmart wishing people a happy shopping experience. We will not tacitly accept the imprisoning of an entire generation of young black men who have been kept out of meaningful employment and limited in their resources by a woefully inadequate education. We will not passively sit back and watch as our gay sisters and brothers are marginalized and our Latino neighbors are initially enslaved to harvest our crops and then cruelly deported. We will not give our sons and daughters for military adventures ginned up by lies to hide corporate profits. And I don't care who is sleeping with whom, as long as my government is continually in bed with corporate interest. Those are the only 2 whores I'm worried about. And if the NSA missed any part of this message, the manuscript will be posted online this afternoon, because I don't want you guys to miss a word of this one.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.